those of you who've not joined these sessions before, my name is Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. And for those of you who are not clients who have not come across us before, we are a specialist crisis management consultancy helping organisations to plan, train, rehearse and sometimes handle the worst day of their corporate lives. And I guess that's very much what today's webinar is really about, looking back at some of last year's biggest crises and also looking forward to 2019 and identifying some of the priorities, some of the trends, some of the things that we believe you should be thinking about and planning for in this new year. And I think the first thing to say is the purpose of this webinar really is learnings. Nice quote here from Otto von Bismarck from, well, a century and a half ago. Only a fool learns from his own mistakes. The wise man learns from the mistakes of others. I would take slight issue with Otto on that. I think we need to learn from our own mistakes, but we certainly need to learn from the mistakes of others. And so as we go through these crises from last year, our intention is not to criticise any of those organisations that found themselves in the firing line. It's very easy to manage a crisis when you're not doing it yourself, and there are things that we just can't know from the outside. So our intention here is to draw the learnings out from them to help you be better prepared, to say, rather than pointing fingers. And the reason that we think that's important is encapsulated in the words of another famous leader, Winston Churchill, who once said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." I also wanted to draw your attention to the timeliness of this session, in that although we're primarily only looking back over the last 12 months, for those of you joining this webinar from the UK and for those of you who are of a similar age to me, you will remember that 30 years ago yesterday, there was a horrific air crash at Kegworth, just off the M1 motorway, in which a British Midland plane crashed. And many people lost their lives. Michael Bishop, who you see here, who's now Lord Glendenbrook, he was the chief executive of British Midland, and he really set the rules for crisis leadership 30 years ago, certainly in terms of communication. As you'll recall, those of you who are a similar age to me, mobile phones were in their infancy, social media didn't exist, but what Michael Bishop did was, immediately upon hearing of the crash, he set off for the scene of the incident. He began communicating with national TV via his brick-sized mobile phone from his car, and from that moment onwards, he did and said all of the things that make for a successful crisis leader. So if you'd like to learn more about that, I posted to LinkedIn yesterday some of the learnings from Michael Bishop's example 30 years ago. And I did just want to mention that, given its timeliness and given that we are looking back in this webinar. As we proceed through the presentation, and we will be finished by 2 o'clock UK at the latest, depending on the number of questions, but we certainly won't overrun. Talking about questions, please do feel free to post those via the chat pane or question box that you should see in your screens, and we will endeavour to cover as many of those questions as possible in the final 5 or 10 minutes of this session. So, a look at some of 2018's high-profile crises and some of the learnings that we can draw from them, and maybe some of the considerations that you can take into your crisis management planning and training in 2019. First of all, Pret-a-Manger. You will probably recall that a young woman died as a result of having eaten a Pret-a-Manger sandwich to which she had an allergic reaction, and died whilst on a BA flight. It had not been labelled correctly. You will see here on this slide the kind of coverage that generated. I think particularly powerful, that one at the top left, Pret-a-Manger from high street darling to industry bogeyman, which shows, you know, how quickly a crisis can take you from hero to zero. So what might be some of the learnings for the people on this call as you think about what happened to Pret-a-Manger and what that might mean for your own planning and your own crisis response should you encounter a situation of that magnitude? Well, I think the first thing to say reflects back to that headline, Pret-a-Manger, high street darling. Pret-a-Manger had a very strong and positive reputation. It was, and to an extent still is, an admired business, one which has a very strong reputation, and one which had invested a lot of time and effort in achieving that. The learning, though, is that however good your reputation, however strong it is, all of that will be at stake and can be lost if you mishandle your crisis response. And in fact, the better your reputation, the more you have at stake. So the higher esteem in which you are held, clearly the potential for the fall to be that much greater should you endure and mishandle your crisis response. So those of you, and there are many on this call with really fantastic reputations, that is an asset going into a crisis, but also remember that that is an asset that must be cherished and protected during the crisis, or else lose that value very, very quickly. Some of the things that Pret-a-Manger appeared to do that harmed them in this crisis were to do with best practice, which has been built up over many years. And when you are under the crisis spotlight, it's very easy and sometimes understandable to set that best practice to one side. You're under pressure, you feel victimized, you're in the spotlight, and so you forget that best practice and you do something different. Do you know what? All of the evidence and experience shows that those principles and guidelines that have been built up over the years work, and they are principles, best practice and guidelines because they work. Things like communicate quickly. If you know you've got a problem or have had a problem, chances are it's going to come out at some point. Much better that you communicate the situation yourselves, take responsibility for it, and don't blame a third party. You may recall that Pret-a-Manger blamed one of their smaller suppliers for causing the issue. That may well have been true. It may not. But even if it was true, it doesn't work when a big brand tries to pin the blame for a major incident onto particularly a smaller third party. It is rarely a successful strategy. Much better to step forward, take responsibility, own the crisis, and take control of it. You have to express concern, compassion and empathy when human lives have been lost or affected. It was something in the example from 30 years ago that Michael Bishop did brilliantly well. Pret-a-Manger appeared, I'm sure this wasn't the case in reality, but appeared to be somewhat cold and corporate in its communication and in its messaging. In a human tragedy, that, you know, typical corporate language clashes with the emotions and the pure human impact of what's happened. And do be open, do be proactive, and do be transparent in your communication. Set the narrative. The other learning, and it's one of the main reasons why it's better to avoid a crisis in the first place rather than have to manage one, is that once in the crisis spotlight, you become a target, particularly a media target. You may recall that a second incident emerged where a customer had died having eaten a Pret-a-Manger product. That second incident was, of course, serious, but the amount of press coverage that it garnered was shaped by Pret-a-Manger having had the first incident. It would have been lower profile if it hadn't been for the first situation. So, say two things coming out of that. Firstly, try to avoid getting in the spotlight in the first place. Secondly, manage the situation well to get out of the spotlight quickly as possible. And thirdly, I said there were three things. There are, in fact, three. The third thing, be aware that if you do endure a crisis, you have to be extra vigilant and extra prepared for the second, third, or fourth crisis that may follow, because being the victim of a crisis once is challenging enough. If you become a serial offender, then that really can do extreme harm to an organisation. So, first set of learnings regarding the Pret-a-Manger incident. Secondly, a whole load of CEOs, and these are just some examples of them that came into the media spotlight due to allegations about their behaviour. The Me Too movement stimulated a lot of this attention, and the two at the top of the slide, Philip Green and Ted Baker's Ray Kelvin, were certainly part of that campaign. The two at the bottom, the CEO of Nissan, Carlos Ghosn, who was recently arrested and jailed due to allegations of financial mishandling. That's a different example of corporate behaviour, and I guess Martin Sorrell, it's a bit misty as to why he ultimately left the business, but certainly, as you see here in this headline from The Guardian, there were bullying and sex worker allegations mentioned as part of his departure, and he was also one of the people who very early in the new year was caught up in the President's Club issue that the FT brought to the forefront. The point here really is that there appears to be an increasing number of business leaders who are entering the spotlight for the wrong reasons, and they are about behaviour. So, what are some of the learnings if you have a high profile or even a celebrity CEO? A high profile CEO on the whole can be a real asset to a business, a real positive, but as with corporate reputation, visibility equals vulnerability. The higher your profile, the more liable you are to being challenged, attacked, and secondly, for an organisation, if the entire or a large part of the reputation of the business is built upon an individual, should that individual be criticised or come under fire, then it can tarnish the whole business, not just their personal reputation. The third point is a broader one. When I began working in crisis management 25 years ago or so, all of the focus was on events, fires, floods, explosions, incidents. Those are still an important part of your crisis management planning. But the more ethical and behavioural crises also need to be part of your planning, not just physical events. Not only does that mean that you have full oversight of the potential challenges that you may face, but it also means that you can prepare for the types of crises which can actually do more damage than an event or an incident. So therefore, things like your reputational risk assessment and crisis planning must cover these kind of people risks. Otherwise, you leave yourself very vulnerable to the kinds of crises that can do you most harm. I would recommend that you involve your HR team in your crisis management planning, and at a more strategic level, instill a crisis-resistant culture. In some of the organisations that have been hit by both Me Too allegations and broader allegations of inappropriate senior management behaviour, there was allegedly a culture in which people knew that things were going on, but were fearful or unable to raise their concerns or for those concerns to be heard. Even if we move away from the moral and ethical challenges with cultures like those, what a culture like that definitively does is it makes you more vulnerable to a crisis. A crisis-resistant organisation needs to be willing to listen to challenging voices and to act on them, not to push them away and not to sweep them under the carpet. So if you want an organisation that is well positioned to prevent and respond well to crises, encourage whistleblowing, encourage challenge. That is the way that you can snuff out small problems before they become major crises. And the other thing is, and again, I'll use the Me Too campaign as the example of this, do be alert to a changing external context and what that means for risk management. In other words, allegations of sexual misbehaviour and bullying against bosses was around, but was not a big issue only 2 years ago. Now, just 24 months later, it is a major issue. And if that has not been recognised within your risk management and crisis management planning, then you have a big hole in your crisis preparedness and greater vulnerability as a result. Our third situation to look back on is TSB, who you will recall was doing an upgrade to its IT infrastructure one weekend in April, and that weekend in April turned into months and months and months of pain and chaos, both for TSB itself, but I guess more importantly to its customers. It was one of the biggest and longest lasting crises of 2018. And I guess that is one of the first areas of learning that I wanted to draw out of the TSB situation. And it's simply that the cost of a crisis can be monumental in many different ways. I'm guessing that most of you on this call already recognize that, or else you probably wouldn't be on this call. But businesses need to recognize that it does matter if you suffer a crisis, and that it will have an impact on the ultimate pain dependent on how you respond to that crisis. So for TSB, they lost, and there have been various figures quoted, but more than 20,000 customers left the business during the months after this incident. That's a lot of customers to lose. They had 159,000 customer complaints. £210 million were spent on remedial action directly associated with the incident. 3 members of the senior management team left the business, plus the CEO who resigned months after the job. One of the big unquantifiables but enormous cost of all crises is the amount of time that must have been spent in dealing with this. TSB cannot have planned this time last year to have spent hundreds of thousands of pounds of, hundreds of thousands of hours responding to a crisis of this nature. They would have anticipated spending that time on far more productive strategic and positive initiatives, not reacting to a crisis. And of course, and these are also scientifically unquantifiable, but they are clear, it has done massive reputational damage, and it has really fractured trust with its stakeholders. A couple of practical learnings beyond that, you know, overall learning about the impact and scale of cost of a crisis. One, successfully responding to a crisis requires an effective operational and communication response. Ironically, Paul Pester's initial response to the crisis in terms of what he said was excellent. It ticked many of those crisis communication best practice boxes, and if the organization had been able to deliver against what he said was going to happen in his pronouncements, actually we might be looking at this case study at this moment in time saying this was a great example of crisis management. Unfortunately, TSB was unable to fix the problem quickly enough, and so great words, but words that suggested the problem was going to be fixed and customers would be compensated, and that didn't happen quickly enough. So in order to successfully manage a crisis, you need to have an effective operational and communication response. The final point is a crisis which strikes at the heart of your values can be catastrophic. TSB had been having a pretty successful time in positioning itself as more caring and therefore different from the big high street banks. They were beginning to carve out a successful niche, almost as your local bank, the one that cares more. This crisis blew that out of the water. It destroyed that positioning very, very quickly. The learning, you know, what is it that is special or different about your organization? What is it that you are banging the drum about to your stakeholders? Therefore, what kind of crisis could do most harm to you in terms of what it is that people expect and have been told to expect from your organization? Those are the crises to be most fearful of. They're the ones to be avoided, planned for, and responded to impeccably. Crisis number 3, and again, please do feel free to send in your comments and questions, and we'll try to deal with at least 2 or 3 of those at the end of this session. KFC, again, as you all know, well, you all know KFC serves fried chicken and a range of other healthy snacks as well, but they are famous for their chicken, Kentucky Fried Chicken. And so when they encountered a situation whereby they couldn't get chicken into their restaurants, it was rather a large business continuity issue. If your business is to serve up chicken and you can't get chicken into the restaurants due to distribution problems, you have a major issue. What we can learn from how KFC responded to that situation is as follows. I believe they handled that situation as well as they possibly could have done. Why? What did they do well? And part of this is based on learnings and insight from their head of brand engagement, Jenny Packwood, who has spoken about the experience at conferences and in published articles. And some of these learnings are kind of from her insight, but all of them I endorse. Own the issue. KFC didn't step back, they didn't hide, they recognized it was their problem and they began communicating quickly. Importantly, the way that they communicated was true to who they were, and in particular, they stuck to their tone of voice. Their tone of voice is personal, friendly, approachable, slightly cheeky, colloquial, and that was their tone of voice in all of their communication. You'll see on this, oh, sorry, you'll see on the previous slide, when I get back to it, that right-hand piece that they posted to social media, some chickens have now crossed the road, the rest are waiting at the Pelican Crossing. So humour in their communication, which can be very risky in a crisis, but because of their natural tone of voice, worked well for them. I guess the learning for those on this call is, what is your organisation's natural tone of voice on a good day, and how effectively can you deploy that on a bad day? How weird and inappropriate would it have been for KFC to have gone all three-piece pinstripe suit in their tone of voice in the aftermath of this crisis? It just wouldn't have rung true. Fourth point, recognise when an issue has turned into a crisis. This situation is one of those quite typical situations where a situation becomes as an issue, it starts as an issue and morphs into a crisis over a period of time. KFC recognised within 48 hours that this was no longer a glitch, but it was a full-blown crisis. The learning for, again, those on this call is, be very vigilant for these creeping crises, the ones that just get incrementally worse, you know, minute by minute, hour by hour, but not in a dramatic or obvious way. One of the really effective ways of avoiding a creeping crisis overwhelming you is, as a situation breaks, set some predetermined triggers for, or criteria that determine the point at which this incident has become a crisis. When the situation reaches that point, you then switch into crisis mode rather than kind of constantly reacting and evaluating as the situation gets gradually worse. KFC were deluged by customer, media, and other stakeholder interest and questions. You know, they needed enormous resources from their consultancies, their agencies, and their own people. Be aware that if you had a major incident, you would need 4, 5, or 10 times as much resources on a normal day. Think about where you are going to get that from. One of the ways that KFC helped to manage their resource was by using social media to actually engage not only customers, but to feed the media as well. So they did a lot less of the traditional kind of interviews or putting spokespeople forward. They filtered communication via their social media channels so that the latest information could be sourced by journalists from that particular place. This was, you know, at the end or towards the end of their crisis, their famous advert, which has their initials rearranged on the bucket and the headline, "We're sorry," and some very straightforward words: a chicken restaurant without any chicken. It's not ideal. Huge apologies to our customers, blah, 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 blah. It's, to my mind, a brilliant kind of riposte and almost end point for the crisis that worked very well for them. Why? Because they were brave. In a crisis, you have to make tough decisions, and courage is required because there is no obvious right or wrong. KFC knew that that was a slightly risky strategy they were taking, but they judged it was the right thing to do. They did say sorry, and many organisations are slow to say sorry, but by doing that, they shaped the narrative. In fact, that advert became a story in its own right, and the story became about KFC's response to the situation rather than the story itself. If you're ever in a situation of this magnitude, what can you do to set the narrative? And finally, again, just to reinforce, be true to your brand and your tone of voice. In the words of Jenny Packwood, we stuck to our brand voice, and we tackled the issue head on. We didn't try to shift blame or responsibility elsewhere. We put our hands up and said it was a massive cock-up. We had a huge amount of goodwill from the media because we weren't hiding. I think there's some really great lessons there from KFC. I'm not suggesting we all take such an irreverent tone of voice, but the principles about being true to ourselves and about being brave, I think really are important and resonate across all organisations. Coming right up to date, you will all remember that just before Christmas, we had drone sightings over Gatwick, and flights were halted for more than 24 hours. And then, lo and behold, for a much shorter time, we had a similar incident at Heathrow Airport yesterday. And you will also recall, as illustrated by this slide, that there were kind of multiple elements to this story, and clearly multiple parties involved. And in a crisis of this magnitude, that is often the case. It's not one single issue, it's not one single organisation. There are many strands to it. What can we learn from that Gatwick drone incident? Well, if you don't or can't take control of a crisis, it will take on a life of its own. There was a feeling that the situation at Gatwick was kind of a little bit out of control and had a mind and a life of its own. In a situation like that, the more you can do to influence or assert control, the better you will be seen. And one of the ways that you can do that is to plan, train and exercise for crisis impact, not cause. So a drone incident is a new cause of a crisis. This is a crisis trigger, again, that didn't really exist 3 years ago. And so it would be understandable that it's a risk which has maybe not been fully considered or fully planned for. However, the impact of the drone issue is that planes are unable to land or take off, and therefore passengers are stuck either on planes or in the airport. That impact, that ultimate event, can be planned for. So have a think in your own organisations and make sure that your crisis planning, training and exercising is capable of addressing the impact of a crisis, not just an individual cause of a crisis. Plan and rehearse a multi-agency response. You know, this situation, you will recall, clearly involved Gatwick Airport itself. It involved the airlines, it involved the emergency services, it involved the military, it involved politicians. Who would likely be involved in a crisis that affects your organisation, and how can you work with those likely third parties to understand how you would collaborate effectively as a team? In any incident where customers, in this case passengers, are affected, getting regular, early, frequent, high quality information to them is always going to be a prerequisite for success. And people always probably want more than you can deliver. Nevertheless, planning to get facts, information, and details of what you're doing to address the situation to your customers should be a critical part of your planning. Because if your customers start to turn against you, particularly via social media or indeed conventional media, that gives you a whole bigger problem to deal with. Get your facts right and your messages clear. I mention this one specifically because of the relatively recent police statement, which was construed as there may not have been drones after all, which was then translated as, we don't think there was a drone after all. That wasn't exactly what the policeman said, and in any case, he should have dealt with the question about whether or not there had been drones at all better. The message is, in a crisis, you have to be very, very clear about your messages and accurate in the information you communicate, or else again, you risk making a difficult situation even worse. And to the point about spokespeople in particular, you must train your spokespeople. It is so important to get the right messages across. You cannot put someone forward who doesn't have a high level of skills to communicate effectively under extraordinary pressure. Thank you again for the questions that are coming in. We've got about 20 minutes to go, probably 10 of which will be me talking, which should allow 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions. And the final 2018 crisis that I wanted to touch on, with sincere apologies, because it's the 2019 situation too, is of course Brexit. And I genuinely and absolutely make no political point or comment on this, but I do also genuinely believe that it has real learnings that we can apply to our own crisis management planning, not planning for Brexit, but crisis management planning more broadly. And here they are. Whenever you begin any significant project, always begin it with a risk assessment and scenario plan for the worst case. You hope and expect that it won't happen, but you have to have considered the worst case and have plans in place. It appears that at various stages through the Brexit process over the last couple of years, that kind of risk assessment and scenario planning didn't happen, or certainly didn't happen early enough. Don't make any big initiatives that you're embarking on, don't allow them to fall into a similar trap. Talked earlier about the importance of reputation, and even more important than reputation is trust. Assuming that one day in the future you may have to deal with a crisis, you will be well served by strong, trusting relationships with your stakeholders, and by being held in high regard by the people who matter and are affected by the situation. Unfortunately, politicians as a whole of all hues are not held in high regard, and so when this process began, they were already damaged goods, and therefore whatever the politicians do and say now, they are not speaking to an audience which really wants to listen to what they're saying. So build trust and relationships in the good times. Align messaging. In a crisis, having a clear, strong, simple voice is so important. And if there's one thing that's certainly been absent from Brexit, is alignment of messages, or indeed any clear message. See it from your stakeholders' perspective, not from your own bubble. Again, politicians from a range of views and a range of hues seem to be approaching Brexit from their own personal agenda. That is not the way that the people out there are looking at this situation. And so again, for you as an organisation, very easy to hunker down into the corporate bunker. You need to have empathy and understanding for those who are affected by your situation. Make tough decisions. Decision making in a crisis is not easy, but it's what you're there to do. One could accuse our politicians of not having made decisions early enough. And show leadership. You know, a crisis is the time when leaders step forward and earn their salt. that's what, you know, your leadership team would need to do in the event of a crisis. Again, one might question whether, again, leaders of all of the political parties and pressure groups have helped with the leadership or lack of it that they have shown through Brexit. So if there's only one thing that has come out of Brexit that is beneficial, maybe it's some learnings around how we can prepare for and manage challenging situations a little bit more effectively. I move on now to 2019. Having looked back, let's look forward, and just a couple of slides on things that we think you should be thinking about going into this new year. So, firstly, we clearly remain in a period of significant social, economic and political turbulence. This will bring greater uncertainty, and uncertainty will pose new challenges to organisations. So the risk landscape out there is a little misty and a little foggy, but there is definitely change going on and there are definitely new challenges. With that in mind, make sure that the crisis management plans which you have in place facilitate a nimble and flexible crisis response. So what I'm suggesting there is a framework, a platform for crisis response, which works not just for the top 5 risks that you have already identified, but which is flexible enough to help you respond to the genuinely unexpected. Secondly, many of 2019's most damaging crises will centre on organisational behaviour, ethics and integrity. It comes back to one of those earlier slides about the high-profile CEOs, but it's broader than that as well. You know, Carillion is a good example of an organisation which, due to its behaviours and culture, you know, had a massive fall in 2018. So, ensure that your crisis planning covers both operational and reputational crises. Though that category of behavioural, ethical and integrity type crises, they're very uncomfortable to consider and to plan for, because it kind of implies that bad things might happen within our organisation, or we might have within our organisation people who don't match up to our ethical standards. But unless you consider those, unless you plan for those kinds of crises, then you do leave yourself very vulnerable should one of those issues occur. As cyber incidents proliferate, organisations will increasingly be judged on their response to an attack rather than the breach itself. So there were many cyber incidents in 2018, Marriott's being one of the biggest and highest profile examples, but we saw many examples in 2018, and we will see many examples in 2019 too. You have to be prepared to respond effectively to those situations, because I think we're now at a point that most reasonable people accept that it is possible to be hacked, that you cannot absolutely prevent a data breach, but what they do expect is for you to respond well to it. So it will not be good enough to go, oh, we couldn't have expected this, sorry, we're looking into it, we'll get back to you later. You have to be ready to respond really effectively, really quickly, or else risk damage to reputation and your business more broadly. Beware complacency around terrorism. This is almost anecdotal, but you will recall that we had in the UK some major terrorist incidents in 2017 and the very early part of 2018. But thank goodness, generally last year was a quieter year for terrorist attacks than we had seen in some recent years. Please don't let that good news mean that you do not plan your response for such an incident, particularly if you're in something like travel and tourism, or where you have a public facing front. Let's hope that 2019 is free of terrorist incidents, but we have to recognise that the threat is still high, and it's important to plan and train your people on what to do just in case that should occur. And finally, people will increasingly judge organisations not just by what they say and do, but how they say it. I think with today's fast-paced world, and I think much more relationship-based world, both offline and online, we still need those crisis management principles and plans. Absolutely, they form the basis of your response. But I think prioritizing your people over plans is a sensible way to go. Again, let me be clear. I'm not saying don't have a crisis management plan. I'm certainly not saying that. But what I am saying is the ability of your people to execute that plan effectively, ultimately, is what will define whether you are successful or not in responding to a crisis. Recognize the importance of tone of voice. It goes back to the KFC. It goes back to the KFC angle. And finally, you know, what do your values imply? What have you told the world that you're about, and how are you going to demonstrate that in your crisis response? Now, I had an email exchange with a client literally in the last 24 hours, and he actually shared with me the mantra of his CEO, and it talks directly to this final bullet point: what do your values imply? And I won't name them because it wasn't an exchange that he had designed for public consumption, so this is an anonymized quote, but I think it encapsulates that final point absolutely brilliantly. The CEO said, "We must be ready for any challenge and be prepared to do our very best for those touched by tragedy. It is an obligation we approach with great humility. In the end, the true test of a company's collective soul is its ability to shine brightly in the darkest of times." I am going to read that last sentence one more time because I think it is brilliant. In the end, the true test of a company's collective soul is its ability to shine brightly in the darkest of times. Absolutely. So, you know, what is your organization's collective soul? And, you know, is it going to shine brightly should you encounter the darkest of times? So that brings me to the end of my thoughts and insights into what we have seen and what we might see in future. I see that we have 2 or 3 questions. So one here from Wendy. Any tips for owning the issue and taking responsibility as communicators whilst working with the legal and insurance team who are inevitably focusing on avoiding liability? Yes, thank you for that question, Wendy. And for those of you on the call who are communicators, you will recognise this perennial challenge. The first thing that I would say, and it very much kind of reflects part of Wendy's question about working with legal and insurance team, I think have those conversations beforehand. When you're engaging in your scenario planning and you're exercising, part of the value of that is to work with your legal and insurance colleagues so that some principles, some ways of working, some agreed guidelines as to what we can and can't say, actually rehearsing and agreeing that ahead of time can be one of the big benefits of doing exercises. much better to have some difficult and challenging conversations then than it is when you're in the heat of the crisis itself and you recognise that I wish we'd had these chats beforehand. Second element, and it relates to the first, but as you know, in all parts of life, relationships are so important. Getting to know your partners, either within the organisation or partner advisors, and building personal relationships, trust and respect beforehand, again, just helps that working relationship when it is required to be deployed for real. And ultimately, I guess I would say it's up to us, whatever our kind of specific area of expertise, to give best advice to our leaders in a crisis. It is then up to those leaders to make the final call about which route they want to take. Myself and a number of colleagues from Insignia were at a fascinating conference just before Christmas where General Counsel for one of our clients did a presentation at a day-long crisis workshop that we were running, and I'll be candid with you, we were kind of fearful about what he might say. Do you know what? He was a very enlightened, pragmatic and business-like lawyer, and his first piece of advice was, the last thing you want to do is to get someone like me running your crisis for you. So the good news is there are some enlightened lawyers out there. Second question, if a third party is to blame for the crisis, should companies still acknowledge this in some way while not pinning the blame on them? I think it's a fine line. It's a fine line. And I think as a minimum, inferring that you are not the initial cause of it, but still taking complete and utter responsibility for the fact that it has happened, and certainly for the response to it, can be a successful message. It's just about staying on the right side of that line, and it's a very narrow line, but it is a trick that can be pulled off. And as Jenny, who asked this question, mentions, you know, KFC did, you know, make it public that it was their distribution supplier that kind of was the cause of this issue, but I don't think at any point they you know, put the responsibility onto that supplier, nor did they try and push the supplier to the forefront, nor did they shirk away from, you know, their personal responsibility for A, what had happened, and B, for leading the response to that situation. So we are now less than 5 minutes away from the end of the webinar. Just a couple of final slides before I let you get on your way. Firstly, just to let you know that in the next couple of months we will be launching a crisis management scorecard, which you'll be able to access via our website. It's free, but I just wanted to whet your appetite for that. It's an online analysis, a questionnaire, a scorecard that will enable you to evaluate where you currently stand in terms of your crisis resilience, and will generate a report around areas that you may like to consider focusing on in terms of building your crisis resilience. This is the first of a series of webinars in 2019. The next one will be at the same time on the 14th of March. The topic to be confirmed shortly, but there will be another webinar the week after next. We are finalising our programme of webinars for the year, and I would genuinely value your views and suggestions as to topics or people or subjects that you would like to see covered in these sessions. We'd be fascinated and would really value hearing your views. So If you are happy to drop me an email after this call with any areas you'd like to be covered, it will help us to shape that 2019 webinar programme. Finally, if there is anything in this webinar that has stimulated your interest, or you have any follow-up questions about any of the case studies, or there's anything we can do to help you in your own crisis management planning or training, of course, don't hesitate to contact me or any of the team. We'd be delighted to help or to elaborate on anything you've heard on the webinar today. Thank you again for joining us. If you're really interested in crisis management insights, there are a number of new blogs on our website to take a look at. There's the LinkedIn article about Michael Bishop. So if you're a real crisis management aficionado and want more than a 1-hour webinar, there is lots of other material via social media and also on our website. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And I wish you a successful and crisis-free afternoon. Thank you very much.